Hello and welcome. This is Deanna Latimer-Hearn, and you're listening to The Culture We Speak podcast, a show promoting awareness and understanding of cultural and linguistic diversity. On today's episode, I have the pleasure of speaking with Miss Yalanda Ludtke of Higher Expectations of Racine County, Wisconsin.
From the flavorful foods we eat to the rhythm of the beats we keep, our hair and clothes define what it means to be chic. For centuries, onlookers have been captivated by our mystique and every aspect of our being that makes us unique. This is the culture we speak.
Welcome. I'm here with Miss Yalanda Ludtke, who is a speech-language pathologist who currently serves as the Collaborative Partnerships Director for Higher Expectations for Racine County. So we recently connected through a mutual friend and colleague. And after our initial meeting, I invited her to be a guest on the podcast in order to shed light on serving historically marginalized communities. So welcome, Ms. Yalanda, to The Culture We Speak.
Thank you so much for having me. This is very exciting.
Yes, I'm excited to get started. So I appreciate you for taking the time out to come. So I know you started out as an early intervention SLP, just based on our previous conversation. And I'm fascinated by people who have sort of, quote unquote, escaped the speech pathology field to do some things outside of what we sort of consider to be a typical or traditional speech pathology role. So can you tell me what prompted your move from early intervention to your current position?
Yeah, so actually, I was prompted by my boss because she had done some collaborating with Higher Expectations as the director of early learning. And so she was familiar with the kind of work that they do and knew that they were creating a position to fill their need to have a dedicated person that is responsible for their early childhood outcome. And I had worked with her for a number of years. First, she was a colleague, and then eventually she became my principal, and then she was the director of the program that I was working for. And over the years, I had just become really active in racial equity work and advocacy for the early learning program and throughout our district. And she recognized that my skill set and the passions that I have were a really good match for the job description. And she called me last year, it was right around this time actually, and told me that she had something that she wanted to talk to me about. And here I am.
Okay. So that sounds like it kind of was meant to be, so to speak. You prepared prior to without maybe knowing that this is the direction that your career would take.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I love early intervention. And I started out in a speech and language classroom that was combined with a 4-year-old kindergarten classroom. So I'd been in classrooms before. I've worked with early childhood. I've done home visits with an early intervention program. And then, at the end of my role as a speech path, I was a traditional itinerant therapist in a school. So I really do love working with the whole family. And I think that something that has been really great about this shift is just being able to work on policy and kind of shifting systems on a broader scale.
Yeah, and I think that's so important. And you mentioned working with the whole family. So typically in our educational setting, we don't get the opportunity to work as closely with the family members. So do you feel that that is a piece that's maybe missing from what we do in a school setting? Or how do you think we could go about shifting how we do that work?
That's a really great question. And I think one of the bright spots of having to do the shift that we did during the pandemic was, the connection with caregivers and the coaching that was able to happen. I wasn't doing that prior. You send notes home, you have parent teacher conferences, you have your annual IEP. And I know some speech paths send home homework or, just have more, either carve out more time in their schedule to do more working with families. But something that I wanted to do had I continued in the school was to shift my practice and try to incorporate more parent coaching and facilitating, which is difficult when it's not a requirement, right? So it's something that you have to build into a child's goals, or you have to have parent.
That makes sense what you're saying about incorporating family and kind of doing a more holistic approach to what it is that for the services that we provide would be wonderful. But I don't know that it's always feasible, like you mentioned, which makes it a challenge. I think there can be a disconnect. And sometimes that carryover is helpful. I know when we went into kind of COVID mode and everything shifted to online, I was a little apprehensive about that aspect of it because I hadn't had to do it in the past. And so going into a situation where the parent is either immediately present in the therapy session or kind of adjacent and popping in and out really changed my perspective about incorporating them into the therapy process beyond that initial early intervention program. I think in early intervention, it's pretty common to have the parents there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And there's a lot of pressure, right? And this would be said for teachers as well. How often are you in a situation where you're not often one on one with your student? And I know for speech pathologists, it's different, but all of a sudden you're in this very intimate space, even though there's a screen and it's just the three of
Mhm.
you or maybe the four of you. And it's very different. I was nervous going into it. I didn't know how it was going to go. And I'd be lying if I said there weren't, sessions that were a struggle or a complete fail. But overall, once I got the hang of it and the families got the hang of it and the kiddos got the hang of it was really great. That
Yeah,
said, there's a whole swath of the population who it just did not work for. And that might have been
definitely.
for many reasons, but I know that there is a huge disconnect in the availability of, Wi-Fi or technology
Exactly.
understanding and things like that. So definitely there were families that we were not able to connect with on the level that they needed. And that's truly unfortunate.
Yes, I think you speak of the digital divide and a lot of the challenges that people face once we went online. I think it was a great idea in theory to do this in
Hmm.
this manner and to pass out these devices, et cetera. But if the systems aren't there, if the supports aren't there to provide opportunities for students to actually engage in this manner, to be online consistently, et cetera, for any number of reasons or challenges that might be faced in different homes, then we're really promoting an equitable outcome at the end of the day. I mean, we're still just having the same issue we had with disparate funding in schools. So,
Yes, absolutely. I had a family who mom was working at a fast food restaurant and her boss was very understanding and allowed staff to bring in their kiddos if they needed to. And
that's awesome.
so he would jump on, in because the restaurant was closed, but the
Yeah.
drive-through was still open. So he would jump on and he'd just be sitting there and every once in a while he would like get his mom's attention if he needed help toggling something on the computer. But I'm like, the lengths that families were going through to try to stay
Yeah.
engaged. It certainly was not on. I just always was very clear to me that attendance issues or completion things, it was not for lack of parents and families trying their very best.
And I think that's the assumption that a lot of people do make that it's the family is not invested. But I think that
Hmm.
particularly when you're in a relatively small space and you have maybe two or three children or more children, even, it's very hard to then separate the space and allow everyone to be online at the same time and to provide that same support that they would have gotten in a classroom setting, maybe. And especially in this sort of
Absolutely.
all of a sudden it's brand new and we're doing it this way. I think it's a hard shift. So I like that you bring up the fact that, not all families had the same resources going in and that made it challenging. I think here in our household we were very privileged in that we could create space and we could set up our children to do this work. My husband does system administration, I do education, so they were kind of it went seamlessly into this online learning process, but I recognize that not everyone has all of that in to fall into place perfectly for them.
Right.
So I do appreciate what you had to say about that. So I want to know a little bit more about your move from one to the other. So how has that been rewarding for you having moved from early intervention into your current position?
Oh, it's been so amazingly rewarding. I
Freeing.
Yes, the schedule flexibility is second to none. And I
Mhm.
know that it's not only shifting into a different line of work, but I know that my boss and the team that she has curated has definitely allowed our organization to have very progressive policies about, hybrid working, work from
Okay.
home, time off and things like that. So all of that is very rewarding and that makes a huge difference in job satisfaction.
Mhm.
Not to mention I went from education to the nonprofit sector and I got a raise,
Oh,
like
wow. Yeah.
a substantial one. And that's not, I think, we don't like to talk about money, but being an educator is hard and there are definitely benefits but there are some drawbacks and one thing that
Mhm.
was really nice for me is getting a nice raise and having a more flexible schedule. I
Yeah.
also really just enjoy so much working so closely with a team of people who are so inspiring and that I'm constantly learning from. My boss is 6 years younger than me, and it's amazing. It's amazing. It's not that much of an age gap, but it's enough to just see a difference in the way things can be. There's just like, it's almost like the sky is the limit of what we're able to dream up and what we're able to create in terms of what kind of environment we want to create and what kind of work we want to put into the world. I'm really passionate about racial equity and doing this work and having these conversations, and it's really great to be working with people who are all coming to work to do the same thing. I definitely had my core group of people when I was working in education who felt as strongly as I did and who were as interested as I am, but it's different when you're going to work and that's the work you're doing.
Yeah, I think that's great. And you mentioned before that you're engaged in setting up policies and shifting how things sort of work. So having a group of people who have that like-minded sort of process of getting that work done, I think is amazing.
Mhm.
And I think at the schools that doesn't always happen, like you mentioned. So,
Right, yeah.
but I think we're also inundated with so much work, and then also, like you said, the taxing situation in terms of the benefits of the job or the challenges that we're facing. In terms of pay, flexibility, et cetera. Those things aren't there, and it becomes such a burden that it's very hard to then do the extras. And that's where I kind of moved out of that setting. I was kind of frustrated with that because it's like I'm trying to work sort of against some of the problems that we see, but I have all this other stuff that I have to lug with me as I'm doing that. So, can you talk a little bit about the career to cradle vision?
Yeah, so Strive Together is a cradle to career network that unites organizations that are working toward equitable outcomes for children. So our partnership, Higher Expectations, is reversed only in its origin, and that we're starting with the end, which is employment, in mind. So if it's career to cradle, cradle to career, really it's just looking at the entire spectrum of a child's life into employment and working toward equitable education and employment outcomes.
And so, what types of initiatives have you been involved in so far in that effort?
So I am currently the lead on our early childhood outcome. And so we are looking at, what does kindergarten readiness mean? What does it mean for educators? What does it mean for families? What does it look like for a kiddo who comes into kindergarten who has had 4K and who hasn't? And
Mhm.
right now I'm working on a systems indicator to look at a child's prenatal up to age 5, looking at, what happens in between those times, those years, because it's one thing to have a checklist of here are some things that are helpful for a child to know going into kindergarten.
Mhm.
But what I think is really meaningful is what opportunities did they have before they reached school,
Yes.
right? So, how many doctors were in the area, how many
Mhm.
doctors were available in the community that they were living in? How many jobs per household did caregivers have? Those kinds of
Mhm.
questions I think are really important to look at. And then after all of those questions are answered, you can kind of start to look at, okay, did a child go to 4K? And if they went to a 4K, how well did they learn letters? How well did they learn numbers? How well did they learn those pre-literacy skills and those pre-academic skills before they go into kindergarten? But if you're just looking at those skills at the end of a 4K year, you're kind of just looking at, well, how well did that program do? And you're not really necessarily looking at the systems that are really
Exactly.
influencing those
Mhm.
outcomes prior to their first day of school.
Yeah. And I think when we look at sort of where a child is when they arrive without considering all of the systems, then we erase all of the inequities that have already been built into what we're experiencing here in this country. So there's so many barriers
100%.
in place.
100%.
Yeah. And we just erase all of that. And then we want to, then for me personally, like this, the frustration becomes like I'm strapping then this idea of a black white achievement gap on the child without having
Yes.
considered all of the things that the systems have done to set up this child for failure.
Yeah.
We're not born with it, as Lisa Delpit has said. We're not born with an achievement gap. There is no disparity in the beginning. So it's very interesting that our system is structured in such a way that we then assign it to the child once they arrive at the school and not
Absolutely.
consider any of the other things that they've gone through. So that's awesome. Okay. So now I want to come hang out with you and do some
Yes,
of the
please
work
do.
you're doing.
It's really a mind shift when you start to think about things in that way instead of, what's missing or, what does a child need to do to get to X goal, it's like what have they gone through to get to this point and which of those experiences were positive and which of those experiences were negative, and how is that playing out in a child's development? And then where
Yeah.
are we placing the blame? Just
Yes.
like you
And then how
said,
do
it
we
shouldn't be
sort
on
of
the
put some,
shouldn't be on the child.
yeah. And then where do we put the supports in place?
Hmm.
How do we sort of answer that in a way that addresses the issue itself and not what we perceive to be a deficit in the person?
Right.
So yeah, I think that's huge. And also in the family, because it extends beyond the child. Even we know we will assign it to the family, not caring about education or even entire race groups or
Yes.
socioeconomic groups. And I'm like, we make these sweeping generalizations that do not apply at all to a
Yeah, we're
lot of
not
folks.
asking why enough times. You come up
Exactly.
with an answer and you have to ask why again, and you keep doing that, right? What is the magic number's five or something?
No, but I think that's so necessary. If you don't look at why, then we're not really identifying the actual issue and the underlying issue. So
Right.
amazing. So are there any specific challenges that you feel your organization faces specifically in your area that maybe are different from other areas? Or do you see similar challenges sort of throughout the US?
I see similar challenges. I think, each community is unique in its makeup and what their history is and what the relationships are amongst the people in the community. Those things make things different from one community to a next. But, racism still definitely exists here, just like it does everywhere. And, we are a neighbor to Milwaukee, which is one of the most segregated cities in the United States, right? So these challenges aren't unique. It's just more about, recognizing that it's not, we're not post racism. Sometimes I think groups of people think that we are past racism and we're not. And it's just making sure that we all recognize like we're still here. We're still in
Yeah.
this spot. Yes, there has been progress, but we have a lot to do.
Yeah, there's a lot to be undone, I think, of with just like we mentioned before already, the structures in place, et cetera. And it starts with that recognition of where we all experience relative sort of ease in some aspect of this process, right? And I know that some much less than others. But I think that it's important to first recognize that. Where do I have sort of this privilege in this situation? And then how do I address where others do not? And how do I support them in that? And so, as I mentioned with the digital divide, that didn't really hit my home in the same way because my family was positioned to
Hmm.
sort of seamlessly transition into that. But I have to then recognize that not every family was in that position. And I think that's a big problem in our field.
Yeah, you have to
Speech
look at like
pathology.
what is your sphere of influence, and yeah, where
Mhm.
where have you been given a privilege that you would be able to help somebody else out in an area that you didn't necessarily need help in, but you recognize that
Exactly.
somebody else does? Or where do you
Yeah.
need to advocate for somebody where you didn't need that advocacy or somebody else had done that work for you, but
Mhm. But it has to go back to that why that you mentioned before. If I don't ask why there's a
mhm,
difference or disparity or this perceived deficit, if I don't ask why that's there, then it ends up just reinforcing the system and allowing these things to continue and allowing
right.
stereotypes and racist perceptions to persist. So
Mhm.
I think that's excellent that you all addressed that. So I wanted to know, I know that part of your bio mentioned that you were in rural areas. Did you do services in rural areas as well? Or
I didn't. I grew up in a rural area. I was splitting
okay.
time between spending time with my mom in Milwaukee and being raised by her parents in a
Okay.
really small rural community. So that's kind of where I'm, splitting time. Other than that, I have done all of my work in cities.
Okay. I was just kind of curious because I have no experience in rural areas. I think I'm very, very small. I won't say no, but very little. And so I was kind of wondering, do you perceive any specific differences just having grown up with that dynamic? Do you perceive differences that maybe educators or SLPs should be aware of in terms of serving communities that are maybe not built the same
Oh,
way?
definitely. I think there's no marginalization Olympics, right? So it's like hard is hard. And
Hmm.
if you're marginalized, you're marginalized. However, we do know that some communities are impacted more than others. And I think what's been really interesting, because I did go to school in a smaller town, I still have friends that are kind of servicing in more rural populated areas. And I hear what some of those issues are. And I think mainly it's the marginalized folks who end up really at a loss because you are so much less likely to have representative service providers in any of the or any of the systems that you encounter, right? So there are just some things that is comforting to know that you have somebody who recognizes your background And I just see that as that's hard because that doesn't tend to be where diverse populations go to provide
Yeah.
services or to live or to relocate. Every once in a while, yes, but it's not the norm. I certainly was the only Black student who graduated in my graduating class. There
Okay.
were a few Black students who attended school with me off and on, but it was usually a foster care placement or a
Okay.
short-term living situation. I was really the
Hmm.
only one that was there as a permanent resident.
Okay. And that had to be very challenging, I would imagine. So,
Yeah, I think it was, and I still think I'm processing it because I think what
mhm,
I did a lot was block out differences and ignore differences to just like
to survive.
because there was nothing I could do about it, right? So I had to survive.
Mhm.
And so I just kind of inserted myself as I am one of this group of people
Mhm.
because I'm here and I'm one of you. And so I think that that was something that a positive experience in that I was not second guessing, like, why is somebody saying X, Y, or Z, unless it was very blatant, because I wouldn't let my mind go there. But that also gave me like a false sense of confidence. But I think it ended up being something that was really useful for me later, because then I was later in positions where I did need to call on that courage or that confidence or that bravery. And it was like an exercised muscle that I had built up over the years, especially
Yeah,
being a child and just being the only person who looked like me.
I can't imagine. I did not have that experience growing up. Definitely had a very interesting as a in terms of race for my undergraduate studies, at Northwestern, that was probably where it kind of hit me the most. Race and socioeconomic status was like, this is different.
Hmm.
so so yeah. So one of my questions that I'd like to ask of all of the guests that come on is when did you realize that your culture or language was different from the mainstream? So I guess that was pretty early for you.
It was. I don't remember ever not knowing that I'm
Hmm.
different, right? Because I was raised by my mom's side and my mom is white. So her side
Okay.
of the family is white. I didn't have interactions with my dad's side of the family. So my recognition of being different was like I look different than everybody around me, but I didn't recognize what that difference meant until I was around the Black side of my cousin's family,
Okay.
because my only cousin is also a multiracial
Mhm.
child of an interracial couple. She had, interactions with her white side of the family, which was my side, and then her Black side of the family, which was her mom's side. And I remember spending some time with her when I was young and with her family. And she's 4 years younger than me. So this, wouldn't have been something that she was picking up on, at least not at that time. And I was looking around and listening to people talk and looking at what people were eating. And I was like, talk like you, don't sound like you, don't eat like you, I look like you look like, but that was uncomfortable for me. And I think I still have to come to terms with that discomfort that I feel
Mhm.
when I'm around my own people.
Yeah, I think being raised in the manner that you said would make that challenging, especially since you learned how to fit in order to
Hmm.
survive. And then, yeah, having different
Yeah.
customs and things like that would be challenging. How did you learn to kind of celebrate or embrace the difference, later in your life?
I would say it's definitely an ongoing process, but I don't know. I've always been the type of person, like I said before, I was probably overly confident. And so I think that I have always kind of liked to be an advocate for the underdog.
Okay.
And that just like, that would show up in other areas of my life when there were like celebrity trials on TV or, like I just, for whatever reason, was rooting for the underdog. And now I just feel like it just feels right. Like it's a value that I hold, and so I
Mhm.
just feel that I feel really strongly about it, which is tricky because I recognize that there are people who feel the exact same way, completely opposite of me,
Mhm.
right? And so that's where I have to try to remember people generally are doing what they think is right, what they think
Yes.
they know is right. That's tricky to come to terms with. It's
I,
ongoing. I would just have to say it's ongoing.
I think it's ongoing in this society anyway. I can think that that's just part of developing and experiencing and sort of growing in a space that maybe wasn't initially meant for you and has this systems in place still that suggest every day or remind you every day that it's not. But I think one big takeaway from that is just that as Black people, we're not monolithic. Like there are so many different experiences that we have in our group, and there are so many different diverse expressions and ways of being that people often dismiss, especially if they're not adjacent to or interacting with our culture. And I think that that's very hard, because then we get painted with this broad brush that suggests that all Black people are one way, or all Black people see issues the same way, or have the same upbringing or same experiences. And we're actually extremely diverse.
Right.
And so I hate that that gets missed. So I think, your experience and your journey is valid because it's yours. It is what it is. And I don't think that you need anyone else to validate that. But I think that there are times where people will invalidate that because it didn't look the same as maybe what their perception of Blackness is.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
changing.
That's like, one of those, I often have been told, I shouldn't say often, but more than once have been told I'm Blacker than you based on,
Yeah. Any number of
whatever,
things.
whatever piece of culture that they like or enjoy,
Same.
things
I
like
mean, I
that.
think that's just part of that journey. It's almost like,
Mhm.
you have to prove that you're attached to a certain aspect of the culture or something in order to be a piece of it. And I don't think
Mhm.
that, I think we have to move away from that because it gives off and reinforces some very negative notions about us, et cetera.
Right.
So yeah, I appreciate you just being open enough to share, your experience, your upbringing, et cetera, and how different it may have been from some, how similar maybe to others.
Yeah, of
So
course.
thank you for that. One other question I did want to ask was, has your new role shifted your perspective at all regarding opportunities for SLPs to engage in advocacy or regarding the training that SLPs receive?
I don't necessarily think my role has impacted that, not yet anyway. I think, the biggest impact that I noticed while I was still practicing was social media.
Mhm.
There's such a huge impact that the way many groups can advocate and can get together. And I think that that's just something that is a great space for recognizing what people are going through in different programs and what's lacking in different programs and the experience
Mhm.
that people are having in real time.
For me, shifting out of sort of the SLP space allowed me to sort of look at it in different ways, but I don't know that I saw it differently per se because of being outside of it, just more or less seeing all of the areas for growth, like separating from it for me was allowed me to look at it, I guess, in a different manner. But it's not
Mhm.
something I wasn't aware of while I was practicing
Right.
personally. Yeah. Do you have any advice or final thoughts for our audience members who might be interested in advocating for culturally and linguistically diverse populations?
I would just say find folks who are doing the meaningful and interesting work that you also are passionate about and go from there.
Excellent. Well, I thank you once again for being a guest on the show and your willingness to do this. And I'm very thankful that we have connected.
Thank you as well. This is a really great opportunity.
You have just listened to The Culture We Speak with your host, Deanna Latimer Hearn. Special thanks to our guest, Miss Yalanda Ludtke, and to Taja Sparkman for the original lyrics to our theme music. Catch the next episode where I discuss microaggressions with Dr. Karen Davis, Associate Professor at Middle Tennessee State University. Be sure to visit theculturewespeak.com and subscribe to keep up with our latest work.